Today we're going to make a concrete planter using pumpkins as the mold. My idea was to build the form out of 2 pumpkins, a big one to form the outside of the planter and a mini pumpkin to form the inside. I really wanted to use my forge cleaver to cut the pumpkin in half, but after a few whacks, we realized that a bread knife might get us a more accurate cut. After separating the seeds for roasting, I gave one half of the pumpkin a good scrape down with a spoon. I wanted the planter to have a natural look, so I wasn't going for a perfectly uniform surface. I was more focusing on removing thickness so that there was enough space everywhere between the inner and outer molds. To create space between the 2 pumpkins, I used my Japanese pole saw to cut a piece of PVC pipe. This will also double as a drainage hole. I cast the planter using a fiber-reinforced concrete mix. It's really important to avoid adding too much water when you're mixing concrete because all of that extra water will dilute the cement and form air voids in the final concrete. However, once the concrete skeleton has been established, which is usually a few hours into curing, additional water will actually strengthen the concrete by helping all of the cement particles finish their chemical reaction. This is why concrete is kept wet while it's curing, and I thought that casting concrete in a pumpkin would create the added benefit of an organic moist curing environment. This idea was sort of correct, but as you'll see shortly, the big pumpkin added a little too much water to the concrete too early in its reaction. But more on that later. Once the pumpkin was full of concrete, I used my jigsaw without a blade to vibrate out as much of the air as I could. We were super excited to see that this pumpkin-formed concrete actually worked, but we noticed that the outside of the planter was covered in a thin layer of muddy, weak concrete. It seemed like the water from the pumpkin oversaturated the outer layer of the planter, but luckily, this only affected the outer millimeter or so. If you're trying this yourself, a really easy way to solve this problem would be covering the inside of the pumpkin in plastic wrap before adding the concrete. That outer layer of muddy, unbonded concrete was easy enough to rinse off in the sink. While the planter was drying, I quickly designed a little grill to put over the drainage hole in Fusion 360. Of course, you could use a little piece of metal screen for this, but I don't have one. What I do have is a 3D printer and some PETG filament. I took some succulent cuttings from my parents' house a couple of months ago, and I've been propagating them on a windowsill in our apartment. They've done really well, and these are what I'm going to be using to fill the planter. Succulents thrive in a well-draining system, so I put down a layer of gravel before filling the planter with cactus potting mix. A chopstick ended up being a really useful tool for planting the succulents. I used it to make a little hole in the soil before inserting each stem, as well as to tamp down the soil around each of the plants. I'm really interested in alternative ways of casting concrete, and I think that this pumpkin technique has some real potential. Pumpkins are relatively cheap, especially when you're comparing them to the price of building materials. I paid $5 for the big pumpkin and $3 for the mini pumpkin. They're also an item that largely get thrown in the garbage after Halloween, so they're ripe for alternative uses. We also used the top half of the big pumpkin to make pumpkin soup, and we roasted the seeds. But more than the planter itself, I am super happy with the succulent arrangement. These little guys traveled a long way. They actually came from the same place as the seashells, and I love how the arrangement feels like a miniature world. I really want to do more projects involving plants in the future, so be sure to subscribe to see those videos. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.
Sorry, why did you look ridiculous walking around?
I felt ridiculous walking around Loblaws because my original idea was to get a really big pumpkin and then like use a smaller pumpkin for the inside, but all of the big pumpkins outside were like way too big to fit inside any of the other big pumpkins. So then I went inside looking for something like this, but this at first looked too big, or no, too small. So I went in like the squash section and was trying to find like a squash that was big enough. So I was basically just walking around the produce section measuring different gourds, like with a tape measure, trying to figure out what was gonna fit inside a pumpkin. People just probably thought I was like some interior designer who was looking for just the right pumpkin.